Never invited again to those kind of parties because he messed up the party. But Jesus was willing to be excluded to include someone that would never be included.
That's very good.
That's him. That is Jesus. It's not the church necessarily around the world. There are exceptions to that. Some churches have got this. Our church didn't, and we were a good church. We were spirit-filled, tongue-talking, Pentecostal. We sang about the lost. We cried for the lost. But we were very exclusive. When you looked at the mix of the congregation, we were all one type of people. And yet we would say we were all inclusive. We loved everyone. But the truth was none of us were reaching anybody outside of our comfort zone.
So tell us what you did about that and how your church responded.
Well, one of the first things I did was I began to regressively reach into the inner city and bring all people that were not our types into our church. And our church, you know, was very safe and very secure. And overnight, we became very unsafe because people came that would steal your stuff, and people came that would, you know, rip off your vehicle, or they would
didn't
use
smell good,
bad
they didn't look
language,
good.
they would smoke, and they were rude, and they did not fit in, and they were not polite. They were not our types. Our types behaved themselves. Our types were orderly and moral and integrous and honest and showed up on time, and these people didn't show up on time, and then they came and used our facilities and sat where you normally sit and just invaded our space. And I was surprised at the response of the church, and it made me realize how exclusive we were. See, we had in our singing and in our praying and in our preaching, we had a theology of being all-inclusive, but our lifestyle was very exclusive. And I think because our theology was all-embracing, our songs about reaching the lost were, of course, all-embracing songs in concept, but our behavior was very exclusive. And so it made me realize that it's possible for people, especially the church, it's possible to believe that we are all-inclusive because our theology and our preaching and our singing is all-inclusive in its words.
And we can even sing those songs and cry.
Exactly. And boy, we had some huge weepers over the lost, and our intercessors were the biggest criers. But when these lost began to come in that were outside of our types and began to disturb the peace of the church, some of the people that were the biggest criers were the most upset people, advising me to calm it down, dilute it, pace ourselves, not reach as many of these kinds of people.
Put them in a certain section.
Put them in and I think they would have been happy. You know, would all the prostitutes sit here? Would all the homeless sit here? You know, would all these different categories sit here? At least then the rest of the church could know we're not going to sit there this morning.
Yeah.
We'll have our own area. And I think thereby goes the story of most churches. Most churches predominantly are one type of person in that church. When you analyze the congregation demographic, it's one type of person. That one type of person is singing about reaching every type of person, but they don't.
Yeah.
That was our church. So we deceived ourselves by our theology. And if you sing about a thing enough, and preach about a thing enough, and amen a thing enough, and cry about a thing enough, I think you think that you're doing it.
Yeah.
And actually we weren't. And I knew we weren't because the moment we started doing it, those that were singing about it were upset that we were now doing it.
But tell us what happened. Your church was like a pretty small, old, more just religious church, and nobody could have even told you where your church was. But
Yes.
as you began to include those that Jesus would include, what's happened in your church since then?
Well, we live in a large city, and not many years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago even, you could have been lost in our city and asked for directions to our church, and no one would have heard of us. Since we've begun to love the city and include the city and bring the city into our circle of love, now thousands that come to our church, to our conferences and our church as visitors and can't find us, tell us that they get lost and ask a stranger. And virtually everybody knows where we are and often says, as a rider, to giving them instructions, is that the place that helps people? And these are the people in the city that may never come to our church, that know we exist, and then have some awareness of why we exist. And I do feel now, you know, I've been 33 years in the same church now. I think we've done more in the last 10 years than we did in the first 20-odd years in terms of letting the city know we live to serve them. It's not our church, it's your church, which was always our theology, but never our practice. I've been amazed how quickly the attitude has changed to us in the city when we've stopped praying over the city only and started reaching out to people.
Yeah.
Now they think well of us. I honestly think, I don't know, I wouldn't like to test it, but it would be interesting. If we shut our church down tomorrow, I wonder if there'd be a riot in the city. I wonder if there'd be a reaction in the city that we cannot live without this church in our community.
That's good.
Maybe that would be a good definition of the relevance of our churches. Would anybody miss us if we closed down?
That's good. And your church has really grown dramatically.
We are thousands now.
Yeah. And you were what then?
We were about 300 back then, and 300 mean-looking people that had a huge theology about doing what we went on to do, and many of those 300 didn't survive this reinvention of the church and couldn't cope with it. That was a shock to me. Now I'm not surprised because I've realized around the world it's common that we do have, even the Apostle Peter on the day of Pentecost preaches, this is to you and to your children and to all the world. So he had a theology of all-inclusiveness, but actually he had a real problem with Gentiles. And God had to help him later realize by sending him the sheet, and the sheet had all kinds of unclean animals, and Peter said, I can't touch any of those, and the really animals represented people. And he said, I can't touch any of these unclean types because, I'm a good Hebrew, I'm a good Jew. And God said to him, nothing's unclean, Peter, that I have accepted. And Peter was catching up to God. But Peter's theology, when you hear him on day of Pentecost, it's like, yes, everyone will now be reached by these Jewish leaders. But Peter had to really deal with it himself. And so if Peter's capable of having that dual standard, I think we all are too. And he was 24/7 with Jesus and still didn't get it.
We're going to talk about this some more when we come back, because I think that people need to really understand who they need to stay away from.
Yes.
And who they need to include.
Right.
It might be a little surprising to find out biblically what God was really saying to us.
Yes.
We'll be right back after this break.